This content is presented for educational, historical, and cultural analysis purposes. All theological interpretations shared here reflect the views of various scholars and traditions, and should be understood as according to the interpretation of unredacted rather than absolute doctrinal claims. Viewers are encouraged to study, verify, and form their own understanding through personal research and spiritual guidance.
If you've ever read the Hebrew Bible or attended a church or synagogue where the 12 tribes of Israel were discussed, you've probably heard names like Judah, Benjamin, Levi, Issachar, Dan, Naphtali. 12 tribes, 12 sons of Jacob. Seems straightforward. But here's a question that stops most people cold the first time they encounter it. Where is the tribe of Joseph? Joseph, the son with the coat of many colors, the dreamer, the one sold into slavery by his brothers, who rose to become the second most powerful man in ancient Egypt. Joseph, who saved his family from famine. Joseph, who wept when he revealed himself to his brothers. Joseph, who is arguably the most detailed and emotionally developed character in the entire book of Genesis. That Joseph, he is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, so logically, there should be a tribe of Joseph among the 12 tribes of Israel, but there isn't. And when you start pulling on that thread, you find something that opens up one of the most fascinating structural decisions in the entire Hebrew Bible. A story involving inheritance, double blessing, adoption, identity, and the quiet mechanics of how ancient societies organized themselves. This is not a mystery requiring supernatural explanation. It is, according to the interpretation of biblical scholars and historians, a story hiding in plain sight. One that becomes more remarkable the closer you look. Let's go find it. Part 1. Setting the stage. Jacob, his sons, and the logic of the 12. To understand why there is no tribe of Joseph, we need to first understand the system that the tribes were operating within. How the 12 tribes of Israel take their names from the 12 sons of the patriarch Jacob, whose name, according to the Genesis narrative, was changed to Israel after a famous nighttime wrestling encounter described in Genesis 32. His sons, in the order most commonly listed in the text, were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin, 12 sons. And in the ancient tribal system described in the Hebrew Bible, each son was understood to be the founding ancestor of a tribe that bore his name. A group of people who shared lineal descent from that ancestor held a territorial inheritance in the land of Canaan and maintained a distinct identity within the larger national structure. This system was not unique to ancient Israel. According to historians who study the ancient Near East, tribal organization based on ancestral lineage was common throughout the region. The names of tribes frequently preserved the name of a founding ancestor, real or legendary, as a way of encoding kinship claims, territorial rights, and social identity, all in a single word. In this system, the number 12 carried significant weight. Scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature have noted that 12 is a structurally important number in many ancient societies, connected to lunar calendars, to the organization of labor and resources across months, and to the symbolic completeness of a full cycle. Whether or not the historical origin of the Israelite tribal system was literally 12 tribes, the final literary presentation in the Hebrew Bible is organized around that number as a meaningful total. And so the number 12 was not incidental, it was load-bearing, it needed to be maintained, and that creates the puzzle. Because when you count the tribes actually listed as receiving territorial inheritance in the land of Canaan, the tribes that appear on ancient maps of the tribal allocations described in the book of Joshua, you find something unexpected. The list includes Ephraim and Manasseh, not Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh were not sons of Jacob, they were grandsons. They were Joseph's sons, born in Egypt to an Egyptian mother named Asenath, daughter of a priest of On. So why do they appear in the tribal list instead of their father Joseph? The answer is found in a single chapter of the book of Genesis, that is, according to the interpretation of many biblical scholars, but one of the most legally and theologically significant passages in the entire patriarchal narrative. Part 2, Genesis 48, the adoption scene that changed everything. Genesis chapter 48 is not a long chapter, but according to the interpretation of scholars across Jewish, Christian, and academic traditions, almost every sentence in it carries legal weight. The setting is Egypt. Jacob, now old, nearly blind, and aware that he is dying, summons Joseph to his bedside. Joseph comes, bringing with him his two sons, Manasseh, the firstborn, and Ephraim, the younger. What follows is one of the most carefully constructed scenes in the Genesis narrative. Here is Genesis 48:5, in which Jacob speaks directly to Joseph. And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. But Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are mine. This single verse, according to the interpretation of scholars of ancient Israelite law and literature, is a formal adoption declaration. Jacob is not speaking metaphorically. He is not expressing affection. He is performing a legal act. In the ancient Near Eastern world, adoption was a recognized legal mechanism for transferring rights, particularly inheritance rights. When a man declared that another's children were his, in a formal context, he was incorporating them into his household with full legal standing as his own sons. And the specific comparison Jacob uses is not random, as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Reuben and Simeon were Jacob's two oldest sons, the sons of his first wife, Leah. They stood at the top of the standard birth order hierarchy, and by comparing Ephraim and Manasseh to them, Jacob was declaring that Joseph's sons would have full tribal standing, not the diminished status of grandsons, but the equal standing of sons. The practical consequence was immediate and lasting. Ephraim and Manasseh were now, in the structure of the Israelite tribal system, counted as independent tribes on the same level as all the other sons of Jacob. And Joseph, as a result, disappeared from the tribal list, replaced by his two sons. But why? Part 3, the double portion, understanding the birthright. To understand why Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh as his own sons, we need to understand a key feature of ancient inheritance law, the concept of the double portion. In many ancient Near Eastern legal traditions, including those reflected in the Hebrew Bible, the firstborn son of a family was entitled to a double share of the inheritance. This was not generosity, it was law. The Hebrew Bible codifies this explicitly in Deuteronomy 21:17, which states that the firstborn is to receive a double portion of all that he has, for he is the first fruits of his strength. The practical meaning of a double portion in a landholding family was straightforward. If a man had 4 sons and a certain amount of land, the firstborn received 2 portions and each of the other 3 received 1. 5 portions divided, 2 going to the eldest. Now, Jacob had 12 sons. If the inheritance was to be divided among them, each son would receive 1 portion of tribal land. Then the firstborn, Reuben, would receive 2. But Jacob, according to the narrative, had a problem with his sons. Several of them had, in his view, disqualified themselves from various honors. Reuben, the firstborn, had committed a serious transgression recorded in Genesis 35:22, an act so severe that Jacob, in his final blessing in Genesis 49, explicitly strips Reuben of his preeminence. You shall not have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed. Simeon and Levi, the second and third sons, had massacred the men of the city of Shechem in an act of violent revenge recorded in Genesis 34. An action Jacob explicitly condemned both at the time, Genesis 34:30, and in his final blessing, Genesis 49:5-7, where he scatters their inheritance. This left the double portion, the birthright, effectively unclaimed. Reason Joseph, according to the narrative logic of Genesis, was the most obvious candidate to receive it. He had been his father's favored son, the son of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, born in Jacob's old age. The famous coat of many colors, or more accurately, according to some Hebrew scholars, a long-sleeved robe, so the exact meaning of the Hebrew ketonet pasim is debated, was a symbol of distinction, of elevated status, of what many interpreters read as implicit designation as heir. Joseph had also saved his entire family from starvation. He had demonstrated extraordinary wisdom, integrity, and faithfulness throughout a long and painful story that included being thrown into a pit, sold as a slave, falsely accused, imprisoned, and ultimately vindicated. According to the narrative, his character had been tested comprehensively and he had not broken. So giving Joseph the double portion made sense, but Jacob chose a specific mechanism for delivering it. Instead of simply declaring Joseph the inheritor of 2 territorial shares, he adopted Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own sons. This had the same mathematical effect. Where Joseph would have received 1 tribal portion, now 2 sons bearing his lineage would each receive 1 portion. The double portion was delivered, but through a generation. This is, according to the interpretation of many biblical scholars, a legally and narratively elegant solution. It honored Joseph with the double portion that reflected his status. It preserved the number 12 in the tribal count, and it gave permanent identity and standing to 2 sons, who, without this act, would have been Egyptians, born in Egypt to an Egyptian mother in the house of an Egyptian official. Part 4, the crossing of the hands, Ephraim over Manasseh. Genesis 48 contains another famous moment that deserves careful attention because it carries significant implications for how the tribal history of Israel developed. After the adoption declaration, Joseph brought his 2 sons close to Jacob for a blessing. He positioned them deliberately, Manasseh, the firstborn, at Jacob's right hand, the hand of honor, the hand from which the greater blessing traditionally flowed. Ephraim, the younger, he placed at Jacob's left. But then Jacob crossed his hands. His right hand and the hand of the greater blessing fell on Ephraim's head. His left hand fell on Manasseh's. Joseph noticed immediately and tried to correct his father, taking his hand to move it. "Not this way, my father. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head." And Jacob refused. Genesis 48:19 records his response. "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." This scene, according to the interpretation of many biblical scholars, is one of a recurring pattern throughout Genesis in which the expected order of inheritance, the priority of the firstborn, is deliberately reversed. Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over his older brothers, and now Ephraim over Manasseh. Whether this pattern is read as theological statement, as cultural memory, or as literary device, the practical consequence in the historical narrative is significant. Ephraim became, according to the subsequent history recorded in the Hebrew Bible, the dominant tribe of the northern region. The northern kingdom established after the death of Solomon, which broke from the southern kingdom of Judah around 930 BCE, according to conventional biblical chronology, was frequently referred to simply as Ephraim in prophetic literature, even though it contained multiple tribes. The prophet Hosea, writing in the 8th century BCE, uses Ephraim as a near synonym for the entire northern kingdom. Manasseh was also a significant tribe. In fact, Manasseh's territory, according to the book of Joshua, was divided into two halves, one on the west side of the Jordan River and one on the east. It was in the region of Gilead. This made Manasseh geographically the largest tribal territory by area, though not necessarily by population or political prominence. So the crossed hands blessing in Genesis 48 was not merely a touching family story. According to the interpretation of historians who work with the tribal geography of ancient Canaan, it was a narrative encoding of a real historical relationship, the prominence of Ephraim over the tribe that, by strict birth order, should have outranked it. Part 5. The tribe of Levi, the other missing tribe. Before we go further, there's a related puzzle worth addressing, because it comes up every time this topic is discussed. If Ephraim and Manasseh each occupy one of the 12 tribal slots and Joseph is absent, the math still has to work out to 12. But there's a complication. Only the tribe of Levi, descended from Jacob's third son, is also in many contexts not counted among the 12 territorial tribes. The reason is different from Joseph's case, but equally fascinating. The Levites, according to the book of Numbers and the book of Joshua, did not receive a territorial inheritance among the tribes of Canaan. Instead, they were designated as the priestly and liturgical servants of the entire community. They were distributed across all the other tribes' territories in 48 designated Levitical cities, towns spread throughout Canaan where Levites would live and serve the local population's religious needs. Numbers 18:20 records the theological rationale in the words addressed to Aaron, the first high priest. "You shall have no inheritance in their land. Neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel." So the Levites had no land of their own. Their inheritance was, in the text's own terms, the Lord himself, meaning their sustenance came from the tithes and offerings of the other tribes, not from their own agricultural land. This means that in a list of 12 landholding tribes, the tribes that actually divided the territory of Canaan, Levi is absent. And here the symmetry becomes clear. Levi's absence creates a slot. Joseph's division into Ephraim and Manasseh fills two slots where one previously existed. The net effect? 12 territorial tribes, always 12. The list shifts depending on the context. Counting all sons of Jacob, Joseph and Levi both appear. That's 12. When counting territorial tribes, Levi is removed, no land. Joseph is split into Ephraim and Manasseh, 2 territories, and that's still 12. According to the interpretation of many scholars, this dual accounting system, the priestly 12 and the territorial 12, was a sophisticated way of maintaining the sacred number while accurately reflecting the reality of how the land and religious roles were actually distributed. Part 6. Asenath, the Egyptian mother and what her presence means. There is a dimension of this story that is sometimes passed over quickly, but that, according to the interpretation of many historians and biblical scholars, carries real weight: the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh were half Egyptian. Their mother, Asenath, was, according to Genesis 41:45, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. And On was a major center of Egyptian religious and intellectual life, associated with the worship of the sun god Ra. Asenath was, by any reasonable reading, a member of the Egyptian priestly class. She was not a foreigner living on the margins of Egyptian society. She was connected to its religious elite. This means that the two largest and most powerful tribes of the northern region, the tribes that would eventually dominate the northern kingdom, were founded by men who were, by ancestry, half Israelite and half Egyptian. This fact seems to have been recognized and addressed directly in the Genesis narrative itself. When Jacob performs his adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh, he is not simply giving them inheritance rights. He is, according to the interpretation of many scholars, also performing an act of identity incorporation. But he is declaring that these two young men, whatever their Egyptian birth and maternal heritage, are now fully members of Israel. The adoption changes not just their legal status, but their identity category. This is a point that later Jewish tradition engaged with carefully. The Midrashic literature are the body of ancient Jewish interpretive texts that expand on and explore the biblical narratives, contains various traditions about Asenath and her relationship to Israelite identity. One tradition, preserved in various forms, suggests that Asenath was not ethnically Egyptian at all, but was actually a granddaughter of Jacob through Dinah, making her secretly Israelite by descent. This tradition, according to scholars who study it appears designed precisely to resolve the tension created by two of Israel's major tribes having an Egyptian mother. Whether or not this tradition is historically accurate, and most scholars treat it as a later interpretive development rather than historical memory, its existence tells us something important. Ancient interpreters recognized the significance of Asenath's identity and felt the need to address it. For the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, then, their founding story encodes both the highest honor in the Israelite system, the double portion of Jacob's blessing, and a quietly complex, mixed heritage that the narrative itself works to integrate. Part 7. Joseph in the Prophets. The persistence of the name. Here is something that surprises many people when they encounter it. Even though there is no territorial tribe named Joseph in the allocation described in Joshua, the name Joseph never fully disappears from the tribal vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible. It persists, it resurfaces, and its reappearances are, according to the interpretation of many biblical scholars, theologically and historically significant. The prophet Ezekiel, writing during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, describes a visionary future restoration of the land of Israel in chapters 47 and 48. In this vision, the land is redistributed among the tribes, and Ezekiel's list is notably different from the historical allocation in Joshua. In Ezekiel 47:13, the text states, "This is the boundary by which you shall divide the land for inheritance among the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph shall have 2 portions." Joseph is back, and he still gets 2 portions, a direct echo of the Genesis 48 double portion, even in a futuristic, visionary context, written centuries after the original. In Ezekiel's vision, Ephraim and Manasseh are not listed separately as individual tribes. Instead, Joseph receives a single combined allocation that carries both of their inheritances as a unit. The double portion is preserved but unified back under the father's name. Many scholars read this as Ezekiel consciously returning to the language of origins, bypassing the specific tribal identities that had developed over centuries and going back to the root. In the context of the exile, when the northern kingdom had been destroyed and its tribes scattered, the invocation of Joseph, rather than Ephraim and Manasseh, may reflect a vision of restoration that transcended the specific tribal fault lines of the divided monarchy period. In the Book of Amos, another 8th century BCE prophet who addressed the northern kingdom, there is a striking use of the phrase House of Joseph to refer to the entire northern political entity. Amos 5:6 reads, "Seek the Lord and live, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph." This usage suggests that in prophetic vocabulary, Joseph remained a living identity label for the northern tribes even long after Ephraim and Manasseh had been their formal names for centuries. In the New Testament, the book of Revelation chapter 7 contains a famous list of 144,000 who are sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. This list is notable for several departures from standard Old Testament tribal lists, and one of them is the inclusion of Joseph as a named tribe. Scholars have spent considerable energy analyzing the Revelation 7 list, and most conclude that it is a theologically shaped list rather than a straightforward genealogical record. But the reappearance of Joseph as a tribal name is, according to many interpreters, a deliberate echo of the patriarchal era, a reaching back to the founding generation. Part 8. The Historical Fate of Ephraim and Manasseh. What archaeology and history tell us we've been working primarily within the biblical text up to this point. But it's worth pausing to ask, what does the historical and archaeological record tell us about Ephraim and Manasseh as actual tribal territories? It's important to be transparent here. The historical record for the early tribal period of ancient Israel is limited and contested. Archaeology cannot confirm most of the specific events described in the book of Joshua and Judges with the kind of detail the texts provide. What archaeology can do is give us a general picture of settlement patterns, material culture, and political organization in the region during the relevant periods. It's with that caveat clearly stated, the central hill country of Canaan, the region that corresponds roughly to the territories assigned to Ephraim and Manasseh in the biblical texts, does show archaeological evidence of significant population increase and new settlement activity during the Iron Age I period, roughly 1200 to 1000 BCE. This period corresponds, at least chronologically, to the era described in the Bible as the settlement of Canaan by the Israelite tribes. Archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, whose work on the early Israelite settlement has been widely read and debated, has documented hundreds of small village sites appearing in the Central Highlands during this period, sites that show a material culture distinct from the Canaanite lowland cities. Whether these villages represent a new population group entering from outside, as the Joshua narrative suggests, or an indigenous population reorganizing itself, as some scholars propose, remains a subject of active scholarly discussion. The evidence does not resolve the question definitively. What is historically well attested is the existence and prominence of the Northern Kingdom, frequently associated with Ephraim, in the period of the divided monarchy, roughly 930 to 722 BCE. Assyrian records, including texts from the reigns of Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, and Sargon II, mention the kingdom of Samaria and its rulers. The famous Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, currently in the British Museum, depicts what many scholars believe is Jehu, king of Israel, paying tribute to the Assyrian king. On the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria in 722 to 720 BCE, recorded both in 2 Kings 17 and in Assyrian royal annals, is one of the most historically corroborated events in the entire biblical narrative. The Assyrian records of Sargon II describe the deportation of a large portion of the northern kingdom's population, a policy the Assyrians used to prevent local resistance in conquered territories. This deportation gave rise to what later tradition called the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel, a tradition that has fascinated historians, religious communities, and popular writers for centuries. Since Ephraim and Manasseh were the dominant northern tribes, their descendants would have been among those deported. The question of what happened to them afterward, whether they assimilated completely, maintained identity in diaspora, or eventually returned, is, according to most historians, genuinely unresolved. The popular traditions about the lost tribes appearing in specific modern communities around the world should be understood as claims that vary widely in their historical credibility and are, in most cases, the subject of serious scholarly skepticism. Part 9. The Literary Architecture of the 12. Why the structure matters. At this point, we've covered the legal mechanics, Genesis 48, adoption, the inheritance logic, the double portion, the priestly exception, Levi's landlessness, the historical background, Ephraim's prominence, and the persistence of Joseph's name in prophetic literature. But there's one more layer worth exploring, the literary architecture of the tribal system itself. We modern readers sometimes approach ancient texts with the assumption that lists are simply records, neutral enumerations of facts. Scholars of ancient literature have increasingly recognized that this assumption doesn't hold. Lists in ancient texts are often carefully constructed literary objects. Their inclusions, exclusions, and orderings carry meaning. The various tribal lists in the Hebrew Bible are a case in point. There are, according to various scholars who have catalogued them, at least a dozen different orderings of the 12 tribes across the Old Testament. The order changes depending on context, geographical, historical, theological, or narrative. In the Book of Numbers, the tribal census lists are organized around military units. In Deuteronomy 33, the tribal blessings reorganize the order based on poetic and symbolic considerations. In Ezekiel's vision, the order changes again. In Revelation 7, it changes yet again, and the differences from all previous lists are striking. What this variability tells scholars is that the 12-tribe system was not a rigid, bureaucratic record, but a flexible symbolic structure. The important thing was not which specific 12 names appeared, but that the total was 12 and that the full scope of Israel's identity was represented. This flexibility is precisely what allowed the system to absorb the substitution of Ephraim and Manasseh for Joseph and Levi without structural collapse. The framework was designed, whether consciously or organically, to accommodate exactly this kind of theological and historical adjustment. According to the interpretation of scholars who study comparative ancient literature, this kind of numerical symbolism with flexible internal content is found in other ancient Near Eastern traditions as well. The point is not genealogical precision. The point is completeness, the representation of a whole. For the Israelite tribal system, 12 encoded the wholeness of the people. Any list that contained 12 names was, symbolically, a complete picture of Israel, regardless of which specific 12 names appeared. Part 10. What Joseph's absence says about Joseph's honor. There is something worth sitting with in this final section. Joseph is, in many ways, the hero of the entire book of Genesis. The narrative gives more space to his story than to any other figure in the book, more than Abraham, more than Isaac, or more than Jacob himself. His story spans 13 chapters, from Genesis 37 to Genesis 50. It is the most novelistic, the most psychologically developed, the most dramatically complete story in the entire patriarchal cycle. And at the end of it all, he doesn't get a tribe, at least not one that bears his name. But according to the interpretation of many Jewish and Christian commentators, this is not a diminishment, it is in fact the opposite. The double portion, the inheritance of 2 tribes rather than 1, was the highest honor available in the Israelite system. It was what the firstborn son normally received, and Joseph received it through a mechanism that was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily gracious. His father formally adopted his sons, elevated them to the status of his own sons, and ensured that their identities would be permanently woven into the fabric of Israel. Joseph didn't just get 1 tribe, he got 2. The fact that those 2 tribes carried the names of his sons rather than his own name is not a loss. It is, according to many interpreters, a different kind of legacy, one that is perhaps more lasting. A man's name on a map lasts as long as the map is used. A man whose sons become founding ancestors of two of the most historically significant tribes in the ancient Near East has left something that, in a sense, goes deeper than a name. There is also a dimension of this worth noting from within the Joseph narrative itself. Joseph in Genesis 50:19-21 speaks some of the most quoted words in the entire book. "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today." This statement, offered by Joseph to his brothers after their father Jacob had died, when they feared Joseph might finally take revenge, is, according to the interpretation of many theologians and ethicists, one of the most profound expressions of forgiveness and providential interpretation in ancient literature. A man who could make that statement, in that moment, after everything he had endured, arguably didn't need his name on a tribe to secure his legacy. His legacy was written into the character of his sons, the survival of his family, and the story that billions of people across three major world religions have read and reflected on for thousands of years. Part 11. The broader pattern: adoption, identity, and belonging in ancient Israel. One final thread before we bring this to a close. The story of Jacob adopting Ephraim and Manasseh is, according to many scholars, part of a broader pattern in the Hebrew Bible that challenges simple biological definitions of identity and belonging. The Israelite tribal system is often imagined as a purely ethnic or genealogical structure. You belong because of who your biological ancestors were. But the textual evidence complicates this picture significantly. Ruth, in the book of Ruth, is a Moabite woman from a people described elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible as adversaries of Israel. Yet she is welcomed into the community of Israel through her faithfulness and loyalty, and she becomes the great-grandmother of King David. Rahab, in the book of Joshua, is a Canaanite woman living in Jericho. She shelters the Israelite spies and is incorporated into the community as a result. Later genealogical traditions in the New Testament book of Matthew list her as an ancestor of Jesus. Caleb, one of the 12 spies sent to scout Canaan in Numbers 13, is specifically identified in several texts as a Kenizzite, a non-Israelite group. Yet he is counted among the tribe of Judah and receives one of the most honored inheritances in the whole land allocation narrative. These examples suggest that, at least according to the interpretation of the texts as they have come down to us, belonging to Israel was never purely a matter of genealogy. Faithfulness, covenant loyalty, and incorporation through formal acts of inclusion, such as Jacob's adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh, were recognized mechanisms by which the boundaries of the community could expand. Ephraim and Manasseh were, in this sense, not exceptions to the Israelite identity system. They were expressions of its most fundamental principle. The community of Israel was defined by covenant and inclusion, not merely by blood. We started with a simple question: why is there no tribe of Joseph in Israel? And the answer, as we've traced it through the text and its historical context, turns out to be less like a mystery and more like an elegant structural decision, one that, according to the interpretation of scholars across many traditions, reflects both ancient legal logic and a deep theological statement about the nature of honor, identity, and inheritance. Joseph didn't lose his place in the story of Israel. He gained a double one, distributed through his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who became among the most significant tribes in the history of the ancient Near East. The mechanism was an adoption, a formal act by a dying patriarch who looked at two young men born in Egypt, to an Egyptian mother and said, "These are mine. They are Israel." The number 12 was preserved. The double portion was honored. The mixed heritage was incorporated, and the name Joseph, rather than disappearing, continued to pulse through prophetic literature for centuries, resurfacing in Ezekiel's vision of restoration, in Amos's lament, in Revelation's symbolic census. Some names, it turns out, don't need to be on a map to be unforgettable. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of biblical history and ancient Near Eastern context valuable, please consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate it. All interpretations shared here represent a range of scholarly and traditional perspectives, not a single doctrinal claim. You are encouraged to read the primary texts yourself and follow the questions wherever they lead you.